To the Donaldson Lecture at conference, no pressure. We'll hear from Andrew Wilson, former MSP and the party's former finance spokesperson, and of course high-profile columnist for the Scotland Sunday. Please warmly welcome Andrew Wilson.
Thank you very much, Derek. And can I say, conference, I regard it as a real privilege to be permitted to give this lecture at such an important annual conference. I do realise there may be someone else speaking today with thoughts for you, but maybe there's room on your broom for some of mine as well. I also know how busy and focused you all are on September the 18th, 2014, but I'd like today to put some thoughts into your mind to turn over as you go about winning on that day, as I firmly believe that we shall. Firstly, I'll argue that we will soon have clarity on the starting point in the white paper for our independent journey as a country. And this will create, I believe, the highest common denominator for progress. Independence is a changing, elusive and tantalising objective, but an imperative for creating the economy and society we seek. Secondly, I'll argue that what happens next, however, is the most important thing. The referendum is not D-Day, but Day One. And in an era of transformation and reform around the world, this party has to be confident in leading reform in this country, whatever the result next September. The vision of what we do with independence when we have it matters enormously. Thirdly, I'll argue that the next transformation for the SNP is from a nationalist to national party, as our name implies, as the unifying leaders of the country, and we go about creating the society we seek. I don't believe there is any existential threat to Scotland or Scottish identity anymore, and we must define ourselves by much more than that. No party is better placed, I believe, to lead the country on the next step in our journey, and we must bring others with us as we seek to deliver on our exciting vision of a vibrant economy and a much fairer society. And finally, I'll argue that as individuals and as a party and as a country, we must embody the change we seek and continue to truly transform the culture of how we do business and go about politics in Scotland for the better. So the title of the lecture is Then What? And the inspiration for it, if there's a slide that will pop up, is this lovely poster from the 2003 Holyrood election. Is it showing? If you remember that, that was the election I left politics in. On the sage advices of Jim Mather, I believe in embracing our sceptics and their emblems and holding them close. And taking an emblem like this and understanding its undoubted power is important. The now ancient Jim Mather is guilty of many things, but he's guilty of many things, but chiefly of reframing the economics of independence argument from an arid fiscal policy bunfight about the starting point to a meaningful vision about the possibilities of what happens next, and he deserves so much credit for what he's done for this party. Don't worry, the poster won't stay up for much longer. For too long, we have allowed the advocates of the way things are now to describe the starting point that they have created as the very thing that thwarts our ability to progress. Where else but in Scotland would an unsustainable financial deficit be used by those who ran it up to argue both that things should stay the same and that they should stay in charge? The underlying message of this lecture is that it is in the creation of the future that our success will lie as a party and as a country, not just in the abstract of policy, but in the creation of the confidence we need in our idea, in our ability to lead, and in the culture of our conduct that will ultimately determine what it feels to live in the Scotland we seek. Now, this poster worked, I believe, because it played on two things at the time. First, a ludicrous sense of disruption. If you look at it, we're talking actual seismic activity here. Possibly the only point not yet raised by the self-styled Project Fear. Now, amusingly, in this poster, we get a chunk of the Lake District and possibly and possibly even Centre Parks, which frankly would win my 3 kids over to independence. And secondly, it plays to the sense of the unknown for what happens then. And at a time when we remember back then, this was at a time when, lest we forget, we had conquered boom and bust. So it was easy to understand how the disruption from the stability of unending growth, followed by an uncertain future, was too much for people at the time, but how times have changed. When I last gave a lecture at SNP conference, it was 1999, and an astonishing 14 years ago. The time has gone so fast. My theme that day was quite controversial, I suppose, in its time, but much less so now. It was that we would find a faster route to independence if we recognised the reality of British identity in many of us and separated that from the British political and governance system. In other words, we should be intensely relaxed about the reality that a sense of Britishness and many shared British institutions would, could and should survive post-independence. Now, this wasn't my idea or even a new idea, but the emphasis was, and it stirred a debate, I think, which was positive. The party now embraces the sense of this, which is a good thing, although I'm not sure we have yet articulated it well and often enough for it to have resonated. This matters, I believe, because it helps people not engaged in the day-to-day of government and how politics works, i.e. nearly everyone, to visualise what changes and what stays the same. To win, we must create the highest common denominator that unifies the majority support for yes. And in doing so, I'd also argue that we should work very hard to ensure that the large number of people living in Scotland who could, if selected, play for England, and I'm one of them, feel as part of the future we seek as anyone else, because the reality is we will. Too much we still allow this discussion to be portrayed as about our attitude to them rather than our own private battle with ourselves. And as we know in our hearts, this question is about us, not them. We need to do more to help the rest of these islands understand this and our motivations, to take the edge out of the emotional response this debate elicits in some, especially in the rest of the UK. And I'd also argue it's about our discipline and our culture in the way we put our arguments and tackle our opponents. In my estimation, so much of the more emotional, negative and puerile arguments come from the No campaign at all levels. But all of us should recognise the responsibility we bear for the conduct of the national discourse all of the time. Because we are stewards of the argument for progress and reform, we have to be better than that and better than everyone else. Keeping things as they are is always easier because people are naturally conservative and find change difficult. Even when they sit like frogs in a pot as the water simmers, feeling comfortable as the inevitability of their demise comes towards them. It's important, however, in our positivism, that we don't forget to point out the negative realities of the status quo, and we should be careful about how we go about that. There are many, many arguments, of course, but I offer you this slide, a very ugly chart, as for me the most convincing one. Don't worry about the fact you can't read it. I mean, focus on the focus on the blue lines. What this shows you is the gap in the EU 25 countries between the richest local area and the poorest local area. In the United Kingdom, the richest area is Mayfair, the poorest is just outside Merseyside. And what that chart shows you is, of all the countries in the European Union, the gap between the richest and the poorest in the United Kingdom is by a country mile the greatest of any country. This is... We have the most unequal economy and society in the EU. It's remarkable. The centralised economic and political model is producing a lousy outcome that is unsustainable and must reform whatever happens next September. The theme of inequality is one that will remain in our politics and great at the established position until it reforms, and we have to do something about it. For me, that's the biggest imperative for change that we can think of. But describing the problem is a necessary but not sufficient case for reform. Politics now passes so many people by that how we prosecute it needs to change to keep up. Parties have to continually develop or they will ossify. The choice we face in under a year is both collective and individual, and the psychology of that interests me. As the renowned philosopher, Professor Albus Dumbledore once noted to his young acolyte Harry Potter, it is our choices, Harry, that define us far more than our abilities. Choice does define us, and the choice we make next September will play a large part in defining the course we take as a nation. But the point of that wonderful quote, spoken as it was to a precocious young talent, is the deeper truth that we surely all recognise in the words of the American songwriter Cy Can. It's not what you've been given, it's what you do with what you've got. Too often, I suggest, in making the argument for independence, we regale ourselves with the former when we should be focused on the latter. So, of course, we have resources and powers and industries and assets, But for example, for me, the argument that because of oil, we can somehow do less or the same amount of work and get more wealth is the opposite of a true independence argument. I don't believe there is any pot of gold, black or otherwise, at the end of the independence rainbow, but there is a toolbox, and that's the most important point. As a wise person I can't source once said that the most important thing is to make the most important thing the most important thing. As a country, yes, we need to convince ourselves of our abilities and what we've been given as our starting point, but the most important thing is what we choose to do with our abilities, our assets and potential when we have the power to do something about it. And of course, we may choose to give that power away again or share it when we have it, but the difference is that we will always have the power to choose for ourselves what we share and what we keep a hold of. The party has come. Nicola asked me off stage when I last spoke at party conference, and it was a decade ago, horrifyingly. And the party, in my view, has come so far in those 10 years, it's absolutely wonderful to observe. However, it's clear that the imperative of the referendum vote has helped sharpen our minds on what exactly it is we mean when we argue for independence, that we will create, as I say in the white paper, the highest common denominator that will unify the most people behind yes. In reality, we should recognise that independence for a country means different things at different points in history and for different countries at any one point in history. We have more independent countries now than ever before, but we also have greater interdependence globally than ever before. The two are not mutually exclusive, as some would have us believe, quite the reverse. Too much time, I would argue, is spent debating with ourselves in this wonderful coalition for yes about our preferred vision of independence. It can be elusive depending on the choices countries make to share their sovereignty, and also in the face of global changes that make the power of states much less clear than what we might imagine. These are simple realities. We know that much will remain shared after a successful independence vote. The crucial difference is that the immediate control over what to share and how and when will always be in the hands of people who live in Scotland rather than elsewhere. Too little time is spent, I would say, imagining the type of future we want for the country, the culture of our politics and democracy, and the way we will do business. And solving this is an opportunity for us all. In my view, too much demand is placed on politicians across countries and cultures to act like managers or administrators rather than leaders. If politics gets stuck in managerialism, it will never lead the way it's required to. Leaders should lead, and administrators and managers should administrate and manage. I often feel that some of the oddest questions faced by our proposition now would be like listening to Nye Bevan outlining his case for the NHS, healthcare for all, free at the point of need, regardless of means. If he was arguing that today, he would be challenged by the politics of now with questions like, "That's all very well, Mr. Bevan, but how many bedpans will you need in Wishaw and who's going to pay for them?" Now more than ever, we need our leaders to lead and offer a vision, and ours do, a direction and a goal for our collective ambitions as a society, and whatever we choose in a year's time. In the daily noise of news and debate, it's very easy to miss some of the deeper underlying trends and changes in the tides as they occur. One such observation for me is that the era of unending growth ended, and as boom and bust were unconquered again, much else changed. Partly because of globalization and the information revolution, and partly because of the cultural change in attitudes for the millennial generation, it's clear that we are now in an epic era of reform and transformation that could continue for a decade and more. Think about it, every major institution in life is going through the same process of reform, challenge and change. The media, the churches, parliament, sport, banks, energy providers, big business, markets, global institutions, government itself, politics, the monarchy, all have been or will be shaken to their foundations by the relentless scrutiny of the public gaze, exposing every frailty in real time. The way things are and have been is changing now and forever around the world, and the sooner we face up to the reality of this, the better. Reform is needed almost everywhere we look, and how institutions and leaders deal with that process is one of the great tests of our time. And the way leaders lead is changing too. But an age of reform we are undoubtedly in. There's deep wisdom, I believe, in many old stories that can help us when we think about this. We remember the labours of Hercules in Greek mythology. The colossal herds of King Aegeus had created a festering mess in the stables which had never been cleaned. Agreeing to clean it in a day, Hercules didn't just shovel the muck in front of him in a never-ending task. His genius was to divert 2 rivers which washed away decades of neglect and cleansed it all, the cleaning out of the Aegean stables. This lateral thought is precisely what leaders of all institutions in life today need to have in mind as they face into an era where change and reform is being asked of all. All the stables must be cleaned, and shoveling the daily load is not enough. But my challenge also to society would be that this is not a spectator sport. Citizenship carries responsibility also, and I believe that's a burden that's increasing on all of us just now. But by the same token, the festering neglect of the establishments that led many institutions is now exposed, and happily will stand no more. So together, this is a huge opportunity to create a new age with new institutions and a better order, and the referendum sits very neatly into this context of global reform, and as the First Minister said in opening the conference, it's our opportunity. So what next of the Scottish National Party in the midst of all this reform? Where next for this remarkable organisation? It's gone through many transformations in its existence, from pressure group to movement to governing party, from opposition party to governing party. And so impressively, in my observation in recent years, as it has lived its own cultural change and assumed a positive mantle of leadership and positivism with remarkable ease. We should never be complacent or risk becoming another establishment institution that will ultimately wither. We need to retain the voice of the outsider to ensure that all are served. Especially as we move through the referendum, we need to think carefully about how we retain our unity, our discipline and sense of purpose, whatever the result. It's crystal clear to me that the only threat to the SNP not winning the subsequent election is the SNP itself. Especially in victory, but also in the event of a result we don't seek, it is critical we prepare for our next transformation. There is, in my view, no existential threat to Scotland and Scottish identity anymore. How people view their identity is about much more than politics and government, and as we recognise this in Britishness, so we must in Scottishness also. Yes, we must nurture it, and with confidence, but the time is approaching, if it's not already here, when it needn't dominate our politics anymore. As Professor James Mitchell rehearsed in this lecture 2 years ago, too much of the distinctiveness of Scottish politics in the past was about opposition to what we are not. The next era must be solely and exclusively about the country and society we seek. And in leading the country through this next transformation, we must have the confidence to emphasise the national in our name rather than the Scottish, and we must consider what it means to be national rather than nationalist in our outlook. For me, this means the ability for us to unify the wonderful, rich diversity of our country behind the progress and reform we desperately require. We must let the other parties continue to define themselves by us and be confident and clear in our purpose, direction and goals beyond independence. Because the referendum, as I've said, is not D-Day, it's day one. Day one in the process of renewing our society and economy to be fit for purpose in the 21st century and beyond. And that must mean much more than changing flags or replicating Whitehill and Westminster in Edinburgh. Many, many hard choices face countries everywhere. And as a relatively small country, we are blessed with the opportunity to unify society behind the path we must take to succeed. Of course, other parties can lead in an independent Scotland as well, but we must prepare to assume the mantle of unifying leadership and continuous reform as the Progressive National Party. And how victors behave in victory matters hugely. Some have said in this debate that the losers should be seen to lose. I disagree. How we behave defines our character as leaders. When President Bill Clinton came to Scotland in June, he said, and I quote, that you will come out of this better regardless if you go about it in the right way. And then people that believe they are now and might be on different sides actually sit down and talk to each other about it. This makes sense to me, and we must lead that. During World War II, when Tom Johnson accepted the post of Scottish Secretary, he did so on the basis that he could set up a Council of State for Scotland composed of all the living ex-Secretaries of State for Scotland of all parties to advise on government policy. This is an interesting example, I think, because when we win, all of the current opponents of independence will cease to be opponents of independence and should be given a clear stake in shaping the outcome to embed its legitimacy. Maybe our 2 former First Ministers and 1 former Labour, Tory and Lib Dem Secretary of State for Scotland, Michael Moore, for example, could be included in the team negotiating the terms for independence and Scotland's relationship with the rest of the UK, and they should be thinking about that now. They're hardly going to argue against their country's interest, although you could be forgiven for mistaking that in some of the more intemperate rhetoric of the moment. And the moment we set our course with yes, the rhetoric from London will change for the better. No beggar thy neighbour policy ever worked anywhere at any time, and we have been through too much together for too long as countries to believe that anything other than a hugely positive relationship of cooperation between Scotland and the rest of the UK will be the outcome. We will have a new constitution to draft that must never be locked in aspic, but must have the ability to endure through the decades that will take substantial people from different perspectives working together. And in all circumstances that follow the vote next September, the SNP must and will be positive, engaged and leading. And underlying all of this must be a determination to reform and transform the culture of our politics for the better. Too much for me of post-war Scottish politics has rested easy in a culture of life being someone else's problem to solve or opportunity to bring. Over the decades, our institutions and leaders became world-class at lobbying power for resource. Given the lack of real power in Scotland, our politics historically is framed around spending money to dry the tears that flow too often, rather than strengthening the sinews of the country itself, addressing symptoms, not causes, and paying the long-term price. The election of an SNP government altered that, and the referendum changes it fundamentally. I do think that there is a broad and growing consensus that the majority will is for Scotland to aim to strike for a Nordic society's model of success, where high economic performance rests alongside remarkable social cohesion and equality. That's the outcome many of us seek, where the middle class is enormous, engaged and contributing to the common weal. However, we must remember that we start this journey from a position we want to change. We cannot pretend to ourselves that it's a short walk or a free lunch along the way. There would be an irony if the Party of National Transformation only wanted to stand still in terms of the way we governed. And there's no point, for example, in replacing the scapegoating of the poor we find repulsive with an equally destructive scapegoating of the better off. The old politics of one side backing economic strength while the other promotes equality cannot stand for the new Scotland. A strong competitive economy and a just and fair society are the 2 pillars on which our success will be built. Too often, for example, we are told that the only way to balance a budget is to cut spending or raise tax. In fact, the most sustainable way is to grow the economy, attract business and investment, and strengthen the tax base. That is the sustainable way to create the society we seek. And whisper it, maybe the SNP and the Labour Party will be able to recognise there's much more that we agree about than disagree about, and find a way to work together. Something tells me that wouldn't have got a clap at the Labour conference. There's more than we disagree about, as I say, and find a way to work together to create the progressive, unified and successful Scotland that we all want. So in conclusion, conference, I want to end on the thoughts of one of the most successful nationalists of the 20th century and one of the most impressive people of the 20th century, nationalism's some virus. His story is remarkable for many reasons, not least that he held no office, no position, but transformed his country with remarkable generosity of spirit to his opponents. We will all recognise the power of this quote. I feel we can probably recognise our own journey on it, hopefully to the last point. But I believe there is so much more power in this one. And it's on this thought that I want to leave you. When all of us come to cast our vote, it will be a collective outcome of many individual choices. And the power for us all as people is in recognising the power in this statement. For too many, for too long in life, chances have been something that other people determined. Our problems are the fault of our boss, our teachers, our families, our partners, the council, the government, whoever. In that thought lies the get-out-of-jail-free card of irresponsibility. We must all realise that we own our own response to whatever life throws our way, no matter how tough it can come. Whether it's the immediate of our daily lives or the major global challenges we face, our response must begin with ourselves and our own attitudes, behaviour and actions. And as the generation charged with the stewardship of this country's next step, we must, as individuals, as a party and as a country, live and breathe the change we want to see in the world. In our conduct as advocates of this cause, we must personify the Scotland we want to achieve and learn to lead as we do with vision, good grace and unifying hope. Because as this man's story demonstrates, in much more difficult circumstances than the ones we enjoy, all things are possible if we determine on our purpose and believe in it. So then what, we are asked? A country that we can be happy to live in and proud to pass on.